It was daytime, and Bekir and Dolores were hiding. She was curious to know who was hidden behind the mask. Our boy brought his finger to his mouth and, in a serene tone, asked her not to make a sound. Far from feeling furious, Dolores' eyes widened in surprise, making her blush. She clenched her fists, and it didn't take long for her to realize that he had the same voice as the Nightblood Hound. While they were hiding, a tense meeting was taking place below. The tall, brown-haired man broke the silence, mentioning that it had been a while. The old man began to show a smile. Humbert recognized him. It was Cardinal Martin Luther of the New Testament faction of the Rune Order. Humbert's attitude changed. He placed a hand over his chest and apologized for his rudeness, explaining that he was just chasing some suspicious rats that seemed to be lurking around the temple. Martin Luther became curious and confused, asking him what he meant by rats. His eyes began to shine, and with a smile, he questioned if he was referring to them. Humbert began to show a nervous smile and shook his head. Then, with a curious look, he extended his hand and asked what brought them to the temple of the Old Testament faction. Closing his eyes and in a calm tone, Martin Luther let out a chuckle and admitted that he had come to snoop around. The tall, brown-haired man began to stare intently at Martin Luther. Noticing this, Humbert felt somewhat confused. The Quo Vadis temple was packed with people. Martin Luther revealed that his New Testament faction's temple was as empty as a desert, while the Old Testament faction's, in contrast, was crowded with believers. He spread his hands and admitted that, although it was shameless, he had come to learn a bit about their methods, recalling that His Holiness the Pope had always valued harmony. With a kind smile, Humbert questioned if there was really any special reason, explaining that it was just that the location was good and the population was large. Hearing this, Martin Luther felt somewhat curious. The two began to show serene smiles and said nothing for several minutes. Noticing this, the tall, brown-haired man began to watch them attentively with a curious gaze, bowing his head to Martin Luther as a sign of respect. Humbert announced that he had to take his leave, as he had a meeting. Martin Luther also bowed his head to Humbert as a sign of respect, lamenting that he had wasted the time of such a distinguished person. With a serious expression, Humbert turned to the guards and asked them to safely escort these people out of the temple. The guards nodded. The tall, brown-haired man showed no expression, while on the other hand Martin Luther maintained his kind smile. Then Humbert clenched his fist tightly. Martin Luther's attention fixed on it, and a smile spread across his face. He began to gaze at the ground, saying that demons swarmed this land to devour them. Humbert turned his back on them and began to walk away in silence. Martin Luther continued, proclaiming that they should not fear, but stand firm. He assured them that they would triumph through the truth, for even if they lost their relatives, their wealth, their honor, and their lives, the truth lived on and would make the empire eternal. Although at first Humbert tried to remain calm and ignore his words, he couldn't. His eyes began to glow with rage, making him grit his teeth hard. At the same time, Bekir and Dolores left the temple and got onto the roof of one of the houses. Our boy considered that this would be enough. As the sun was setting, Bekir turned his back to her and explained that they wouldn't be chased anymore, as they had left the area around the temple. Dolores began to gaze at the sun and was sincere, thanking Bekir while she was blushing. She took off her hood and in a confused and curious tone asked how he had recognized her. Bekir continued to keep his back to her, stating that he recognized her at a glance. Dolores placed her hands on her chest, her eyes widening with surprise and awe. Our boy turned around and, in a calm tone, explained that her disguise was too obvious, so obvious that it was strange the others hadn't noticed. Dolores closed her eyes and began to smile. Then she brought her fist to her mouth and began to smile. Noticing this, our boy grew curious, wondering why she was smiling. With tears of happiness in her eyes, she began to observe our boy attentively. She apologized if she had offended him, clarifying that it was not her intention. After a sigh, she noted that he could make jokes now and felt that the atmosphere had changed a little. She began to gaze at the ground and, as her eyes shone, she sank into her thoughts. She remembered that when the Nightblood Hound had grabbed her a moment ago, she had thought it was Bikir. She began to recall past events, like her encounter with Bikir on the academy stairs and when they hid to avoid Quilty. She wondered if the reason for her hunch was because those events were very similar to what she had just experienced. While she was lost in her thoughts, Bikir called her name, snapping her out of her trance. Her eyes widened with surprise and curiosity. Bikir moved closer to her and, in a serious tone, asked why she, the saint of the New Testament, had come to the Old Testament's temple, all while keeping her identity a secret. Dolores began to ponder in silence. Then she lowered her head. Her eyes filled with sadness. With honesty, she admitted that the internal conflict between the Old and New Testament factions in Quo Vadis had given rise to the proliferation of heresies and sects. Bikir listened in silence without interrupting. She explained that, even in the midst of the chaos, she was secretly infiltrating to investigate the financial flow of the Old Testament faction, which had amassed a fortune. Dolores clutched her arm. Feeling even more sad, she began to look at the ground and revealed that the Pope was showing symptoms of dementia, and she didn't know if he was even aware of the current situation. She added that she was just a saint in name only. The sun was setting. She began to contemplate the beautiful sun and was sincere, admitting that she had no real power. Because of this, she had no other choice but to act on her own. Bikir began to stare intently at Dolores in silence, his eyes shining with seriousness. Recognizing that these were certainly problems too big for the saint to face alone. Dolores's eyes were shining with sadness. She remained silent, lost in her thoughts. Bikir knew better than anyone that in the future she would become a heroine, respected and with immense power. But for now, she was nothing more than a little girl, whose adoptive family was also tied to demons and with almost no one to trust. His eyes began to shine as after hearing what the saint said, he now understood everything clearly. Bikir began to piece the puzzle together in his mind, Humbat's source of funding, the heretics and sects, the indulgences. With this, the puzzle was complete. He extended his hand to the side and was sincere, revealing that it was most likely that the Old Testament faction, to gain an advantage over the New Testament, had sold religious autonomy to heresies and sects in the form of indulgences, and that it had done so at a very high price. Dolores began to observe Bikir in silence without saying a single word. Bikir knew that Cardinal Martin Luther surely suspected this, and that's why he came here. Hearing this, Dolores's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. But then she thought that Bikir was right. She placed her hand under her chin and, with a serene expression, began to ponder. She couldn't believe that Cardinal Martin Luther had seen all this coming, and that the Nightblood Hound had as well. Bikir observed her in silence, not knowing what was on her mind. Dolores's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked the Nightblood Hound if, having investigated so thoroughly, it could be that there was a connection to demons once again. With a calm expression, Bikir nodded his head. Dolores began to take steps backward, deducing that the sects and heresies were recent and emerging movements. If demons were involved, they must be manipulating them from the shadows, without revealing their true identity. As the sunlight illuminated the place, Bikir moved closer to her and confirmed that she was correct, as the real enemy was always behind the curtain. Bikir remained silent, waiting to see her reaction. Dolores felt somewhat relieved and furious upon realizing that it was just as she had imagined. The Nightblood Hound was still fighting. Still alone, in silence and in pain. Without wasting a single second more, she started to run towards our boy, closed her eyes and, while blushing, took his hands, asking him to please let her help too. Bikir was a bit surprised, not knowing what to do or how to react. With an embarrassed expression, she said that, although it wasn't much, she believed she could be of help. Bekir asked her if, in that case, she could use the same buff she used in the battle against Dantalion last time. Dolores's eyes widened in surprise and she nodded, although she didn't know if she could use such a powerful ability again. Bekir had her let go of his hands, turned his back to her and informed her that, to start, they would have to eradicate the heresies and sects presumably connected to the Old Testament faction. With a serious look, Bekir revealed that he had a way to wipe them all out at once. She placed her hands on her chest, her eyes widening with curiosity and confusion. She wanted to know what our boy had in mind. Without wasting any more time, Bekir began to point his finger at her. As the sun was setting, he got straight to the point, revealing that he needed her body. At first, Dolores was a bit confused, thinking she had misheard, but then her eyes widened in confusion, making her blush like a tomato. The only thing she could do was scream in panic. Our boy continued to point at her in silence. This is the end of the video. If you want to see the next part, then please subscribe to our channel.